It's on. It is on background for if there are any journalists with us. It is live captioned. Microphones of the attendees are muted. You can read the rest. If you have questions, send a chat message through the Zoom chat to ACM Policy. And let's see if the technology will work. Sorry about that. There we go. So the mission of the Ustpc, the U.S. Technology Policy Council, is described here. We're the focal point for ACM's interaction with U.S. government organizations, the computing community, and the U.S. public. It's open to any member of ACM. I'll get in a second to how to join if you're interested. And what this particular webinar is about is it comes out of a statement on principles for secure remote test administration that we released on August 12th of this year. And it's a really timely topic. And if you're interested in joining us to participate in other policy discussions, if you're an ACM member, this is how to do it. You email us, tell us you're interested, pick at least one of the 8 subcommittees that you want to participate in, and we will get back to you promptly. And with that, I'm going to introduce Cory Doctorow, who is going to moderate today's session. And hold on a second. Why did that not work for me? Cory is a science fiction author, activist, and journal author of many books, most recently Radicalized and Walk Away, Science Fiction for Adults, How to Destroy Surveillance Capitalism, which is nonfiction about monopoly and conspiracy, In Real Life, a graphic novel, and the picture book, Posey the Monster Slayer. His latest book is Attack Surface, a standalone adult sequel to Little Brother, and also Shakedown. And he's written about monopoly and fairness in the creative arts labor market. In 2020, he was inducted into the Canadian Science Fiction and Fantasy Hall of Fame. It's an unusual background for someone working in U.S. Technology Policy Council, and we are thrilled to have him. Cory, over to you.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you, Jeremy, and to USACM. It's a pleasure to do this work. Definitely having a background in science fiction is more coterminal than with tech policy issues than you might think, given that the key question that science fiction tries to resolve is not just what do our gadgets do, but who do they do them for, and who do they do them to, and how might that be reconfigured. We have a great panel today. We've lost one of our panelists, unfortunately, due to a apparently no injury involved car problem. And so we will be missing Elana, but we have 3 very good panelists today, and they present a kind of in the round view of the question we're addressing, which is the question of remote invigilation, remote test taking, which is something that's been around for a long time, but like many other things that were in the periphery, really came to the fore during the lockdown period, where all of a sudden things that used to be fringe activities like going on Zoom suddenly became central to people's lives in ways that they'd never considered before. And as we know, when you take something that's done at the fringes and doesn't seem to give rise to any problems and suddenly expose millions of people to it, you discover use cases and defects that were never visible before. So we have today a CS student, a cyber lawyer, and a cybersecurity expert, which is just about as good a set of perspectives as you could ask for this kind of matter. And I'm going to let them each introduce themselves, say a brief word or two about their views on this, and then they each have a short prepared presentation, and then we're going to have a kind of crosstalk discussion and go to your own questions. You'll see that there's a questions Q&A box down there at the bottom of your Zoom. The ever-changing Zoom UI has buttons that come and go. This is one of those Zoom UIs that has the Q&A. You can jump in that Q&A box and type questions for us, and we'll be plucking the good ones out of there. I'm sure they'll all be very good ones, and putting them to the panelists. So with that, I'd like to start by asking Barbara to introduce herself briefly and tell us a few things about her views on the subject today.
Yes, I'm Dr. Barbara Endicott-Popovsky. I'm a faculty member at the University of Washington, and I also head up the Center for Information Assurance and Cybersecurity at the U. I've been very active in the Center of Academic Excellence programs since graduating with my PhD, which was fairly recently. I felt inspired to go back to get that doctoral degree, to study under some folks like Dr. Deb Frinke. Some of you may know who she is. She's a founder and a leader in the field, and somebody worth listening to, as she was there at the beginning of this field of cybersecurity and how it became professionalized. I'm interested in this topic as a microcosm of many things that happened during the pandemic. As Cory mentioned, we became accustomed to working from our homes, and our world became our computers. And for me, this is the perfect introduction to what Mark Zuckerberg is calling the Metaverse, or being involved with virtual reality and submerged in it, to where we're part of this incredible environment that we've created. And concepts that we need to keep in mind that apply to every application like the one we're talking about. And I'll share that with you in a little while. Other than that, I think, Cory, I'll hand it off to the next person and save my rationale for my turn.
Cory, you're muted.
You know, it's not a Zoom meeting till someone speaks while muted. And I'm one of those people who's got two different mute buttons. I've got a hardware one and a software one. Getting them both aligned is like playing a very old, very boring video game. My apologies. Thank you, Barbara. Chris, can we pass it on to you now to introduce yourself and your views on the subject? Thank you.
Yes, and I'm glad to see another person from UW. So I'm Christopher Kang. I'm a senior and double majoring in computer science and economics at the University of Washington, Seattle. So in addition to tech policy, I'm also interested in full stack quantum computation, but for the focus of tech policy, this has really been an experience for me to see the world of how policy is made on the technology side and really recognize how technologists need to be playing a more active role actually in forming tech policy. So I'm really glad that Barbara brought up cybersecurity, because my mind went in a totally different direction, which is how do we get more students and software engineers and technologists to recognize that policy is an important part of the role that we play in society, especially given the scale of technologist impact. So that's what I would like to talk about in my brief 2 to 3 minute overview, is how we can encourage a generation of my peers to be more involved in the tech policy process.
That's a good science fictional kind of approach, asking, as I say, what it is. Not just what it is technology does, but who it's doing it for and who it's doing it to. Cody, I will forgive you the misplaced consonant in your name. We all know that third letter should be an R. And I'll ask you to introduce yourself and also your views on the subject.
Well, Cory, I think many of the people who meet me the first time often insist that that third consonant or third letter should also be an R. So you are in the majority there. Hi, everyone. Good evening to you, and thank you for joining us. I'm Cody Venzke. I'm a policy counsel at the Center for Democracy and Technology. We're a 501c3 nonprofit here in Washington that works on protecting civil rights and civil liberties in a technological age. We've been around since the foundation of the internet, and we take a multidisciplinary approach to technology policy. So we not only have lawyers like me, but we also have policy wonks and critically technologists like Christopher. My team, which is the Equity and Civic Technology team, focuses on governmental use of data, especially in the education space. And I'm lucky enough to have a PhD in computer science accompanying me to make sure I don't mess up the tech when we advocate for policy. Also, just a quick preview, I'll be approaching the discussion today from both a privacy perspective, but also an equity and civil rights perspective, which the remote proctoring technology raises a number of concerns in all those fields, and I'm looking forward to our discussion.
Very good. In fact, why don't you kick it off, Cody? Can you take us through your presentation?
Be happy to. So, as I mentioned, I'll be approaching the topic today with equity and privacy considerations in mind. When we approach remote proctoring software, it comes under a variety of names, but we're talking about software that schools have been implementing both prior to the pandemic, but really came to the forefront in the age of remote learning that they use to administer tests in the place of adults who would normally proctor exams in person in school. And this software can come in a variety of circumstances. One, at probably what I would call the low end of concern, is a teacher watching his or her students take an exam over Zoom to see if there's anything amiss. But a number of companies, which I think is the focus of today's discussion, have started offering software to fill that space that was traditionally filled by a teacher. And that software can come in two varieties. One is a stranger who is employed by the company, watches students take exams over proprietary software. The second is software that uses artificial intelligence in the place of a human, or sometimes in conjunction with the human, to also remote proctor exams. I'm going to focus on those two latter aspects, the artificial intelligence and an employee by a company outside of the education entity watching students take the exams live. On the artificial intelligence front, there are both equity and privacy concerns that come up. On the equity front, the artificial intelligence is often used in facial recognition or similar technologies. There's a number of studies that have documented pretty extensively that facial recognition technology can have inequitable results for students of color, especially Black students, as well as transgender students, often misidentifying them, which can create obstacles for students taking the exams, such as kicking them out of the exam partway through, or not recognizing them as a person registered for the test, and therefore not even permitting them to sit for the exam to start with. Artificial intelligence software can also have a number of privacy concerns. This technology may require a student to give up administrative access to their computer, or to lock down an application, or see what documents they have stored on the computer. These all raise serious privacy concerns as well as security concerns as well. There's similar issues if you have an employee of a test proctoring company administering the exam remotely. This is a stranger to the student who the student may not know or trust, who could be collecting valuable information, sensitive information on the student, such as scans of their identification, or even getting constant glimpses into the student's private space 24/7. There's been a lot of reporting on this test subject, but one great piece of reporting came from a publication called The Verge over the summer. I'm going to briefly put this up. I'm not doing a slide deck, and you don't need to read this through, but you can see highlighted some of the pieces of information this software gathers in order to work. An upload of a photo ID, gathering of biometric information such as keystrokes, a visual scan of the room around the student, as well as remote administrative access to the computer. This is all sensitive information that a student is being asked to hand off with almost no vetting, no opportunity to consent, and no opportunity to challenge. So those factors alone should give us pause about allowing this sort of technology to be employed in schools, whether remote learning or not. I don't want to take up too much time. So one last note I wanted to emphasize here. In the education space, especially the K-12 space, some of the software might be well structured to navigate around privacy laws like FERPA or COPPA. But just because it complies with those privacy laws requirements, many of which are 20 or 40 years old, doesn't necessarily mean that it's ethical. On top of that, there are other laws protecting students based on discrimination or disparate impact due to race, their transgender status, or disability status. And those laws bear on this issue as well. Happy to discuss this more, but I'll hand it back to Cory to hand it to our other panelists.
Thank you very much, Cody. Yeah, as we were saying before this, even if it turns out that they're not violating any laws, if the very best thing you can say about a product is that it's not actually a crime to use it, it's hardly a ringing endorsement. Christopher, can we move on to you, and then Barbara will close out with your more forward-looking views. Thank you.
Yeah, and I appreciate Cody for bringing up the ethics point of the software, because I think in large part that has been the student perspective on RTA software, right? We've seen this, and it is extraordinarily concerning to have people in our private spaces. And I think that's been an impetus for my interest in tech policy. And I've been thinking more about how we get students and technologists in general to think of policy as a valid career path and a valid responsibility. And I've come to the conclusion that there's really two changes that we need to create as a community in order to make progress. So the first one is cultural. And so when I think about my student experience, professors, students, as computer scientists, we really love to cling to abstractions, right? It's not algorithms interacting with people, it's algorithms interacting with users, right? And users have this very specific way that we've modeled mathematically of acting, right? Algorithms have this very specific algorithmic behavior. We need to be really conscious when we're using abstractions because people are very different from real users, right? The impacts of algorithms are multifaceted and they're dramatic for different users of different types, right? So culturally, we need to be willing to break those abstractions, however uncomfortable it is, and actually recognize the empirical, real, tangible impacts that are being done to actual users, real people. On the other end, we need curriculum to change at universities. So I'm really proud to say that UW CSE is now offering ethics every quarter. I actually say that we should go a step further and make ethics a requirement of the CS degree. And I say that because when we look at other similar established fields like civil engineering, which have huge impacts on people's lives, ethics are a required component of their degree and professional licensures. CS doesn't really have as solid of a degree of professional licensures, but we can still play a critical role in saying to students, ethics needs to be considered. We're not just doing this to users, we're doing this to real people. Our algorithms, our software, our hardware has real tangible impacts on people from vastly different backgrounds. And so if we can have these cultural shifts and this embrace of ethics in the curriculum, I think we'll see a lot more students and technologists being willing to actually participate in this policy process.
Yeah, thank you very much. I second all of that. And I'm interested not just in the changes to CS curriculum that we might make to improve the ways that technologists think about the impact of their work, but also the underlying pedagogy that gives rise to the demand for remote proctoring. I'm going to paste a link into the chat for everyone here to a paper from a Georgetown law professor, Lindsay Barrett, who sums up just a series of pedagogical responses to lockdown and mechanisms for doing assessment that supported by evidence that does not require the kind of intrusive proctoring that is the hallmark of contemporary high stakes testing. And it would be the only thing that would be more of a shame than all of the people who find themselves on the wrong end of a high stakes test and either held back or traumatized in some way by it, is if the high stakes tests themselves weren't doing what they were supposed to do, if all that harm was for nothing and we could do something better. So Barbara, you have a much more forward-looking view on this, something that relates to a subject very much in the news, this metaverse subject. And certainly that's a thing that a lot of people ask science fiction writers about whenever it crops up. And I always say, cyberpunk was always meant as a warning and not a suggestion. And the number of tech executives who seem to miss the fact that the executives who bring into being things like metaverses are inevitably the villains of the novels that they appear in is genuinely baffling to me and makes me despair for reading comprehension. I'm sure you have a much more nuanced take on it. I'm really looking forward to hearing what you have to say. So please take it away.
Thank you, Cory. I've spent time imagining what it was like to be alive in the agricultural age. I enjoy history. I grew up on the East Coast. I had several trips to Mount Vernon and got a firsthand look at how George Washington lived. I tried to put that lifestyle on and imagine what it was like to be alive then. Moving forward to the industrial age, much different way of being. We didn't get up with the sun and go to bed with the sunset. We were slaves to the factory whistle, so our biorhythms were interrupted. Our jobs were broken down into pieces. We had the assembly line. If any of you remember Charlie Chaplin's favorite movie, Modern Times, do you remember he went nuts on the assembly line because he's a bumpkin from the farm somewhere and he shows up, gets a job, and he spends all day long tightening 2 screws on a template. And he goes crazy. We divided jobs into pieces in the industrial age, which allowed us to create these corporations, these large organizations that allowed us to accumulate money and do amazing things. But in the course of breaking things into pieces, when the internet shows up, we started to knit it back together. And I'll refer to another favorite novel of mine, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. We just had Halloween. And if you recall, if you've read that book, it's pretty sad. Frankenstein is put together from body parts and he's stitched together and he's made an ugly mess. And as much as people might have feared his wrath and anger, they were also afraid of how ugly he was. And he just simply wasn't accepted by the population. So knitting Frankenstein back together left a lot of scars. And I would suggest that what we're going through with the information age is we're knitting these pieces back together that have been perfectly siloed. And somebody, I think, Christopher, you mentioned we need different kinds of courses at universities. I would so agree with you, because if anything is siloed, it's disciplines at a university. And where we're headed is going to require an integration of all these disciplines. So I would argue that it's not just the computer science people that need to understand policy. The policy people need to understand the computer scientists. I had an interesting experience a couple years ago. I went to Daegu and looked at universities that were being put together in South Korea. And it was fascinating because South Korea uses their educational system to support the businesses, the industries that dominate. And they ended up creating departments at one university that reflected the strengths of the Korean economy. So you had a department in robotics. It consisted of psychologists, computer scientists, and so forth. All of the different disciplines that need to play into robotics. And I suggest that we could take a page from their experience and think about how we're shaping our computer scientists, our policymakers, and how we're isolating them from information and not enabling this new world that we're creating. Because what we're really doing with the internet, we're stitching everything together. And if we're not careful, we're going to end up with an ugly Frankenstein. And I might argue that what we're seeing discussed in the news about social media and the social media tech giants is a reflection of something ugly that came out of that just do it Nike approach that Americans have. Let's just get it done. Let's just adopt this technology. We didn't think through the consequences on people. What are we talking about in the news? How social media impacts children. We didn't think about concepts and effects on society. What are we talking about in the news? Just exactly that. The use of social media to sway people's thinking, to influence elections. Now, who would have thought of that? I mean, certainly not the computer scientist that's working on the bits and bytes and focused on making it work. And I'm hoping that in this next transition, because I frankly think the information age is not over. I think we're going through another transition in this idea of the metaverse. I hope that we include at the table the ethicists that Cody and Christopher are talking about, that we include at the table policy people that are aware enough of technology to make sensible policy decisions, because what we're really doing is we're recrafting a new world. Ethics, absolutely. I'm so happy to hear that CSE is teaching ethics. Ethics has got to be at the center of all of this. And so when we think about these discoveries from the COVID period, where we've learned how to take tests online, where we've learned how to meet online, where our worlds are really focused on our computers now, and we're stepping inside, just like a virtual reality. We're stepping inside. I don't do much of anything outside of my computer. I don't buy postage stamps. Of course, we use email. I don't go to the grocery store. I use Instacart. My life revolves around this computer. And that's the habits that I picked up during COVID when we were so isolated and in our homes 24/7. And coming out of this COVID pandemic, that's not going to be forgotten. And I think we're going to see the continuous evolution of what our friend Mark Zuckerberg is calling the metaverse. And I agree with him. I think this is going to be our reality and we're building it. But we need to really incorporate these other disciplines, these other views. I heard someone yesterday quote somebody, I can't remember who it was, said that an algorithm is a digitized opinion. Well, that's interesting, because an algorithm is meant to reflect reality, but actually, whose reality? And over time, these impacts of algorithms do reflect the ethics, the opinions, the views of the world that the creators intend. And who died and made them king? We did. We love our technology, but we have to recognize that it has its limitations, and we need to have a broader conversation about everything else that has to play. I mean, Cody, you're working on privacy issues, and I'm very grateful that there are people like you that are recognizing the invasion of privacy and how we better hold the phone here. Let's stop and think about what we're doing. And so my comments are not so much about the specificity of this particular application of testing. It's more about thinking big picture and what we're actually constructing in other areas like testing, where we're becoming used to doing things online. We need to have some thought about what kind of world are we creating for our children, for ourselves. And so that's my big picture view, Cory.
Thanks, Barbara. That's really interesting. And, we've had some good chat in the chat and in the Q&A, and I'll remind you, send your questions to the Q&A just so we can marshal them a little better. And S. Rose asked about the failing of the facial recognition software, or I think they sometimes call it something else. They call it like facial identification software or something. This is like when Disney said that they weren't fingerprinting children at the turnstiles. They were gathering the unique biometric identifiers of their fingertips.
Who needs fingerprints, right?
Yeah, it's like those people at the ball game that have a T-shirt that says it's not a bald spot, it's a solar panel for a sex machine. It's not very convincing. But I wanted to ask, I guess all of you, but particularly Cody, the question of whether FR discriminates against students of color and trans students and other students who are marginalized is an important one, but it suggests a remedy that I'm concerned about, which is that if we could fix it so that it recognized all faces with equal fidelity, that maybe things would be better. And I'm always reminded of something my colleague at EFF, Cindy Cohen, talks about whenever this issue comes up. She said, there was a big problem with Chinese state-owned enterprises doing accurate FR on faces of people of African descent. Luckily, they had a partnership with the country of Zimbabwe and its security apparatus. So the country of Zimbabwe turned over its entire driving license database to Chinese state-owned industries, who produced an extremely high fidelity tracking tool for people of African descent. This is not a result, right? Like we did not improve lives for people of African descent by making it easier to surveil them. And so the question is the problem that we have bad FR that struggles differentially along a power gradient with different kinds of users, or is the problem that we are using FR in this context, right? Is that the issue? And perhaps you could say a word or two also about this thing you were talking to me about before we went on air, which is this idea that we have people who are in person doing remote invigilation for reasons that baffle me.
Absolutely. So the short answer is that the equity issues that stem from remote proctoring and other facial recognition technologies are not just an engineering problem that can be solved with more data. That is part of the issue, though. So any sort of algorithm takes place both with a data set and a social context. The data set here is part of the issue, where you have limited data being fed into the algorithm to train it to recognize and detect faces, and that can lead to a disproportionate equitable impact on students of color as well as transgender students. To that extent, an engineer might be able to find a way to obtain a more representative data set, but that alone does not address the fact that the algorithm takes place in a social context, that people are interpreting the output of the algorithm, that they may be misunderstanding the algorithm, and that they bring along their own biases and social context along in implementing what the algorithm might suggest. And that is not an engineering problem that can be simply solved with a better data set. It's important to recognize too that equity is more than just treating everyone equally and the same. We agree that equal treatment is an important consideration, but the example you gave, Cory, is a good one, where there are certain spheres of individual life where we ask others, including the state and schools, to respect. And putting cameras in a student's computer and surveilling them while they take an exam, including a high stakes exam, simply transgresses that boundary of personal autonomy and personal dignity. And the use of the technology in that space cannot be engineered out of. And so there are deeper concerns here than just the data set that's used to train the technology. As far as your second question, which is the use of this software in in-person exams, that is indeed something that is occurring, where you will see that large schools in large courses may have online exams, and they are contracting with these companies to monitor and administer the exams remotely, even though the students are all sitting together in a computer lab. And so that creates potential avenues for this technology to continue to be used, even once we are in a post-pandemic period.
That's wild. Christopher, Charles asks for some clarification, and I have a question for you as well. Charles just wants to know if it's true that UW doesn't have ethics courses as a requirement for CS students. I think that's not what you were saying, but I'd be interested in hearing what you have to say. But I'm also interested in your view about what the role of, as a student, what the role of the institution should be in procuring this software. You know, we know that, for example, Ian Linkletter, who's an ed tech specialist at the University of British Columbia, was asked to assess Proctorio for his employers. And in so doing, he discovered that Proctorio's public statements about how invasive their technology was did not match with the materials they were actually providing to educators. And so he published these materials. They'd given links to private but or unpublished but public YouTube videos, and he put them in a Twitter thread where he's like, this is ghastly, I can't believe they're doing it. And they brought a pretextual lawsuit against him, which he eventually won, that ended up costing him $50,000 to knock back the slap. And at the time there was a lot of talk, and I think there still is some, that the institution that buys software from a firm like Proctorio should, as part of its contracting, just say, if we assess your tool and we have critical things to say about it, as a condition of selling this to us, you have to promise that you're not going to sue us for investigating whether or not your sales promises are true and disclosing when they're not. This feels like a minimum standard of prudence. And I wondered if you had any other views about institutional responsibility, since, you know, ultimately it's the rare educator who just off their own bat just types, you know, what can I use to make my test secure into a search engine, and then ask their students to use it. This is being handed down on an institutional basis.
Sure, and I'll start with the easier question to address, which is the first one. So at UW-CS, no, it is not a requirement for the degree program. Ethics is not a requirement. And in fact, at none of the top 5 schools, I believe, ethics is a requirement. I don't think even in the top 10 schools, ethics is a requirement. And since we don't have professional licensures in CS, right, there's essentially no requirement to take ethics, which I think is enormously concerning, given that products like Facebook, or now should I call Meta, right? These impact billions and billions of people, and they impact them in multifaceted ways that we still are having trouble to quantify, right? And so, again, coming back to abstractions, we love to focus on the abstractions of engaging with people in specific domains in ways that we think of it. But at the heart of it, coming back to what Barbara and Cody have both said, we're in essence, when we code up algorithms, we're putting in opinions. This is a process of operationalization, right? Like how social scientists would say it. When you search on Amazon by relevance, what does relevance actually mean? Right? You're using some wild proxy, and you're operationalizing this process. Most algorithms are essentially operationalizing in some domain, and so you're expressing opinions. And so it's extraordinarily concerning that students aren't thinking about this and getting active exposure to this critical thinking in this domain. From an institutional responsibility perspective, One thing that I've learned through conversations is that FERPA is actually enormously complex, and that FERPA also doesn't provide a clear standard for what software meets it. And so this pushes institutions to really be afraid in some domains, because if you have a FERPA violation, you can lose all federal funding, right? And that's a huge deal. And so I can empathize with educators and administrators who want to combat cheating, but at the same time are kind of stuck in a hard place because they're not sure which software is valid to use. And so they turn to whatever has the best marketing promises. And I think that there's also a complex relationship that would be a longer discussion about academic integrity, about the focus on universities more as career preparation than as actual societal and citizen preparation, and in this remote testing and remote invigilation space. So I think those are some of my thoughts, and it's more along the lines of this is all very complex and has deep ramifications into how we value our society to be structured.
Thank you, Chris. Barbara, I'm interested in this question of the metaverse and cheating and controlling your digital life and what it means to be moving into a digital realm where more and more of our stuff disappears into our laptop. I mean, like you, I spend every hour that God sends with my fingers glued to my keys and my eyes glued to my screen. So I empathize strongly with your view that this is something we need to be taking seriously. In the context of cheating, you have this odd thing where the computer that you use and that you own and that you depend on in this very intimate way that you were so articulate about is your adversary, or rather it thinks you are its adversary, right? The whole point of asking your computer to stop you from cheating, it's technologically indistinguishable from asking your computer to ignore the commands you give to it. And, you know, we've seen the first kind of inklings of this. There is a big debate this week about Chromium and Chrome, where the Google Classroom tools that allowed educators to create quizzes and tests for their students, for reasons, again, that escape me, include the answers to those tests in the HTML. And so any student who views the source of a test that they've been asked to take can find the answers to their test. And the response to this, I guess, predictably, given the arc of so much of this technology, the response of this has not been to create a kind of client-server link so that the tests are just never sent to the client or the answers are never sent to the client. It's instead to create a fork of Chrome where view source is disabled, right? So that you can mandate that students use tools that are as opaque as possible to them so that it's easier to boss them around with the computer that they rely on for everything. And I try to project this into the metaverse, and it starts to look a lot like some of the weirdest and most technologically improbable bits of early cyberpunk. You know, there's the bit at the beginning of William Gibson's second novel, Count Zero, where someone is connected to a VR rig and they do the wrong thing and their VR rig begins to administer a lethal shock to them. And you have to imagine that if you owned a computer that was designed to administer lethal shocks to you, you might disable that function, especially before you did something that might trigger it, but even just as a matter of general prudence. And so you're left imagining that there's something about this computer that actually prohibits it from administering lethal shocks. There's like some mix of policy and technology, DRM or whatever. You start to, you know, when you think about this mentality that says if students are using view source to understand how their computers work, we have to take away view source, as opposed to like not sending them the answers, that this idea that we will just increasingly design computers that boss their owners around becomes more likely seeming, less likely than I would have given it as a writer. That feels like something implausible. You're a cybersecurity expert, and you're someone who's quite enthusiastic about this meta business. How do we resolve this tension? Are we headed for a virtual world that's also a virtual prison?
I think that's a very good question, Cory. I hope not, but given the nature of mankind, I think that's what I have a friend who is a psychiatrist who works a lot with people who are part of large organizations. And he made the comment that when the founder of the organization retires or goes and does something else, that it leaves a vacuum and you begin to see political nonsense going on, a deviation from interest in the subject of the company. The people who are coming along are not passionate necessarily ultimately about the central thrust of the organization. And gradually over time, the sociopaths rise to the top. And, you know, that's what he observed in his practice, which really wasn't very encouraging. But I think when you look around you at behaviors and what people are thinking about and doing today, there's part of me that's not very hopeful for mankind, because I think there may be people who think that the rest of those idiots out there need to be controlled, so we need to lock down. And I also think there may be people who also want to explore the ultimate extremes of this new technology and may be tempted to do other things. I really don't have the answer. I think it's very important that those of us that are involved with technology begin to partner with the other disciplines and start to think about what they can add to the conversation. I'm involved with a large regional activity around Bonneville Power Association emanating from Portland State University. And one of my colleagues is one of those Ben Franklin, widely diverse, backgrounded people. And he started in neuroscience. He ended up moving into computer science, and now he's back. And you'd be interested in this, Christopher. He's looking at policy, local government policy related to technology. And he's combining all of these things. But he really thinks that understanding the human being and the human mind and how it operates may be a good activity for us to think about in connection, for example, with cybersecurity, as we think about ways in which we isolate systems from adversaries and hone them for a more perfect function. I would suggest that this metaverse that I'm talking about, the central expertise that I think people will have to have, besides an understanding of ethics, is cybersecurity. Because now we're knitting everything together, and we have to make sure that the pieces that we put together are cyber secure. And I have something else to say about that that's off topic, but more thought needs to be taken in looking at what disciplines to bring to the table, who needs to have an active part in the conversation. I'm seeing students like Christopher appear. I have a young colleague at the city of Seattle, Omari. He's really unusual. He's a techie, but he has that human side, and he's starting to get it. And what I'm wondering is if we're seeing an evolution of the technologists themselves, that the younger generation does recognize the need for societal inclusion and the individual's inclusion in order to balance out the purely technical approach. I think we're at the beginnings of this. I wish I had more answers. I don't, Cory, but I do think that we need to be paying attention to this. Can I add another?
Yeah, sure. Barbara, go ahead.
One of the things that reflects this highly isolated, siloed world that we're emerging from is the development of definitions of terms that are peculiar. First time I'm into this, I was at the Boeing company, and Boeing was looking at integrating factory manufacturing. They had the silos. You hand things off to each part of the assembly line, but they saw efficiencies in a horizontal approach. And so we did an experiment. Let's see what we could do to make it easier for doors to be built. don't have so many silos involved. Build the manufacturing process horizontally. And one day we had a team of people from all these different disciplines sitting around the table talking about a particular problem. And at some point, someone said from human resources that they think there needs to be an intervention in so-and-so's organization. Well, he took offense. He didn't understand that human resources thinks of an intervention in a specific way. It's a kind of a technique that you use to get people to come to the table and see each other's differences and resolve them. He thought it was like in that old TV show Branded, where we're going to rip the stripes off the guy's shoulders, tear up all of his credentials and throw him out into the desert. No, that's not what it meant. It took me 20 minutes to wind back the conversation to find out where we lost this gentleman, where he went off the rails. I mean, he sat there for the longest time with steam coming out of his ears. And when he finally understood what the term meant, he went, wait a minute, is that what you mean? Yes. He goes, oh. And I've had a buddy of mine who heads up a significant part of DHS complain about the same thing. Now that we have cybersecurity as a big problem in critical infrastructure, you're seeing CISA at DHS talking about cybersecurity in terms that they've developed. If you go out on CISA's website, they have their own standards, they have their own terms. And then over here, you have NSA NIST developing some terms, and sometimes they don't meet, and sometimes they don't communicate. And he said, Barbara, can you help me? So a couple of my friends and I wrote a paper recently, it's being published, that talks about the need for this integration. We're going back to the idea that we're integrating things all together. This is where we're headed. This is going to happen whether we say yes or no. Whether we create the metaverse or not, it's going to happen. We're going to get reintegrated. And what are we going to use as a language? What are the standards? And somebody mentioned that we need professions where people have to pass certain ethical boards or show different knowledge. That's where we're headed with cybersecurity for sure. It's beginning to evolve like medicine, with specialties, with internships. You can look at the NICE framework on NIST, and it'll show you 33 career pathways in cyber. Can you believe that? And there are more being created, 33. When I started, there was one. But now we have all these specialists, and that's both good and bad. So anyway, enough of that. I just think there needs to be some groundwork.
That was very good. And I'll just mention as a technical note, we had a little trouble with your audio. If it happens again, I'm just going to rudely interrupt you and ask you to turn off your video just to see if we can get your audio quality.
I thought so.
Okay, but I'll let you know if it happens again. So we're closing in on the end of the hour. It's gone quickly. One of our organizers here, Jeremy, asked a pretty good question, which is, now that we're seeing professional accreditation, and I assume he was talking about bar exams being taken over by this kind of remote invigilation, and there being some pretty significant scandals related to it, students finding themselves accused of cheating when they are pretty clear that they weren't, and so on. Is this the moment where we actually have a reckoning and we go from, I guess an economist would say the principal agent problem, where the people who buy the software don't have to use the software, and so the software doesn't have to be very good, and finally we have people of social agency who use it? Or, the other possibility is that it follows the bad technology adoption curve we see elsewhere, where when a technology is kind of bad for the human spirit, we apply it first to people who don't have a lot of agency, like refugees or criminals or blue-collar workers or people who are mentally ill. And then we work our way up the privilege gradient. And so, 20 years ago, if a CCTV was observing you as you ate your dinner, it was because you were in a Supermax. And today it's because you bought a home video system from Google or Apple. And might we just normalize this treatment for people of fantastic agency? And then lose any hope of a political movement to push it back. And I'd be interested in any of your views on this.
I think, Cory, that what we see here in the use of remote proctoring software is the complete breakdown of, as you put it, the principal agent conceptualization of this problem, and as we would put it in privacy circles, the notice and consent model. for a generation and a half, privacy has hinged on the idea that you may collect and use data as long as you have let people know what data you're collecting and how it's going to be used. And what we have seen over the course of the past 10 years, as Barbara has described, is a complete breakdown in the veil that is a functional system. And there's a number of reasons for that. One is there's often not sufficient capacity for the users of that technology to assess what exactly is happening to the data, either by reading the technical policies or breaking down what is happening in the technical background behind the software of the application. Another reason is often the opportunity to really consent doesn't exist. And that's either because of the situation you've identified where the people making decisions about software are not the actual on-the-ground users, but also because what does it mean to consent if your education is on the line in using this software and there's not a realistic opportunity to use something else? So what we've seen is the notice and consent model, this principal agent model, is not really descriptive of what people have an opportunity to do. And again, it means returning to fundamentals and thinking about, if we can't count on consent now, what sort of limitations based on ethical foundations should we be implementing? And that's one thing we have advocated for is use and purpose restrictions. If you cannot have a product that delivers a service for students, but also respects reasonable limitations on the use of that data, then maybe that product shouldn't exist at all.
Yeah, we have two more questions from the audience that I definitely want to get to, and we are in our last 8 minutes. So I don't know if either of you had anything to add to that, or we'll move to those last two questions. All right.
I was going to add on to what Cody was saying, right? So the nature of a requirement to use this software is certainly one dimension. I would also say that in our personal lives, with the choice to use software or social media platforms, right, there is an enormous wealth of data, and you can request that data, but that doesn't mean that you request the insights that they gather from that data. They have such a volume and wealth of data, and the data exhibit such strong complementarities, like the economic side of me is saying it, right? There's so much additional value from having it. There's agglomerative value that even getting the choice to periodically remove the data from their systems or downloading the data yourself doesn't expose the true depth of insights that they're able to glean, not only individually, but in a macroscopic properties. And so I think there's, from the policy perspective, there are deeper discussions to be had about what does it actually mean to have data on one person versus 1 million? And how does that impact the way that we regulate this?
Yeah, I think that's very well said. And I've just been told by Adam, we actually have another half hour if we need to take it. It was, the webinar was scheduled for an hour. Q&A is a half an hour at the end, which is great. Karen Gebhardt asks a very practical question. She says, I'm an online educator required to ensure the student who's registered for the course completes the coursework. What are your recommendations to meet this requirement while maintaining ethical and privacy standards? And, you know, I empathize with this, right? You know, there's this jam yesterday, jam tomorrow, no jam today problem where, you know, we had education where we didn't have this question. Tomorrow we may arrive at something that doesn't raise this question. But what is the person who shows up for work this morning and needs to actually do their job and doesn't make the policy choice? What do they do to make this better? And, you know, I'm interested in your views. Whenever I get questions like this, I think of that joke from Ireland that if you wanted to get there, I wouldn't start from here. I hope maybe you have a more practical view on this than I do. Chris, Barbara, Cody, don't leave Karen hanging.
I can start, but Barbara and Cody, you should feel free to jump in. Some of the recommendations that I presented to my own administration during the time, and I have to applaud them in that, actually, that when we switched to COVID, actually, none of the Allen School, none of the UW-CSE's classes used RTA software. And in part, that was because of student initiatives to push for that, but it's also because professors recognized how concerning it is. So one alternative was shifting to project-based work. Project-based work is very, very common, especially in the informatics schools, and it works well, right? In other domains, so there's approaches in changing the assignments, but also I'd encourage you to ask structural questions. Why is there a culture that feeds this need for academic misconduct. For example, when curves are used in classes, when grades are curved, that creates kind of a prisoner's dilemma where if you don't cheat, you're actually penalized for that, right? So structural things like curves or course layout can be catalysts for academic dishonesty, right? And so there's a practical approach of changing assignments, changing assessments, and then there's also the structural questions that need to be asked about, like, why do students feel the need to even cheat in this situation?
Yeah, I mean, that I think that's right. It is, you know, just to be very clear, that is a bit of a, if you wanted to get there, I wouldn't start from here kind of answer, but that may be the right answer, right? I taught on a Fulbright at USC in 2006-07 in the public diplomacy school, and we talked. It was about digital copyright and global politics, and the weekly assignment was to find the Wikipedia entries most relevant to our weekly discussion and to flesh out the missing citations, to take our readings and find good citations from our readings and add them wherever you saw a citation needed. And then we just stuck it up on a big projector at the front of the classroom every week and walked through whether those were good citations. And it was a very hard assignment to cheat on because you would have to describe why you made it. And it also produced a kind of public good in that it made the literature on a subject that I cared about as an instructor that was a little under theorized at the time and, you know, had poor quality public resources. It made them better. So it was, I called my students my little botnet, and it went very well. Barbara, I wonder if you have any views on this.
Yeah, yes, I agree with Chris that an answer is project work. I also think that quizzes, at least in the courses that I've built, I have a MOOC, a massively open online course called The Essentials of Cybersecurity on the Harvard LMS. And the quizzes and the tests that we offer are graded automatically by computer. Of course, they don't require essay answers, but it does allow for the assignment to become, or the test assignment to become a check that people have learned the information. And it's simply an opportunity to go to the next level. So the course itself is built so that if they pass the quiz, they can take the next module. And in that way, we keep track of what people are learning, but we focus on the projects that are critical thinking, problem solving challenges as the main way to grade.
I like that answer very much. Samantha Houty, forgive me if I mispronounce your surname, Houty or Hautia, asks a really good question in the Q&A, and it's as they say at the Q&A mic, more of a comment than a question, but it's a very good one, which is that one of the problems that we're struggling with here is why education exists, right? What are you testing to find out whether or not you've done a good job educating people? And it feels like, as she says, proctoring software is a firm argument the purpose of education should be enforcing control and compliance. And you know, I don't know that this group of us, you know, one of the things that came up in the planning for this is that none of us are pedagogists. Some of us are educators, but none of us are pedagogists. You know, I know what my view is on this as an educator, but I wonder if any of you three, given this very provocative intervention from Samantha, have any thoughts about what the argument that is made by proctoring as we practice it is, and what other kinds of assessment might make better arguments. You know, for example, project-based learning. What does project-based learning tell students and the institution they're in and the employers they might seek employment from later, or collaborators they might collaborate with? What does project-based learning say about the purpose of learning? I see 2 unmuted mics, but no speech.
Uh-oh.
I can start again, but my answer is more broad than anything, right? Because I think there's a deeper question, which is to ask, what is really the role of education in an environment that's technologically more economically suited for robots than people? So one concept that we've discussed in economics is skill bias technological change, so SBTC. And SBTC is this concept that there are really 2 classes of working that are emerging in this modern economy. There's the class that is very focused on intellectual, using computers to enhance productivity work. And there's the class that is very manual, kind of Polanyi's paradox, right? Where you know more than you cannot say, which is why robotics is such a challenging task. But I bring that up specifically because we seem to not have answered that question either with how we want our education system to respond to these SBTC, to this skill bias technological change. Because in large part, we've left behind a lot of people who just simply haven't been able to adapt to the role of technology. And so if the focus is really more economic output, then it becomes, how do we shift those people back to working into society, right? And that creates an entirely different education landscape than if you say, well, the focus of education is to produce the most academics, which is certainly what with our panel is skewed towards, right? We're all more academic in this environment. And it's also different from what we want all of our students to go end up in careers. And so I think it's a deeper question about what we really value as a society and what we think the role of education is in, maybe in a robotic world, in an automated world. So I think that's definitely more of a flowery answer, and I think Cody can probably talk a lot more to the pragmatics of this.
I will speak to the pragmatics as well as one sort of high-level thought, which is there's a certain denuding of privacy when it's thought of as just a compliance model where you check the box that you provided your notice and you got the consent forms back and you put them in a file and you're good to go. Privacy is really at its foundation about respecting an individual's autonomy and dignity. And that is true of students and at the K-12 level, children as well. It is a delicate balance. I'm a former high school teacher, and I know that in order to achieve the educational goals that the institution is behind, finding the balance between a 17-year-old's autonomy and teaching Algebra 2 is a fine one to achieve. But just because there's a balance doesn't mean you can toss out the idea that a student has autonomy and dignity completely out the window. So that's a high-level remark. As for the pragmatics, both to this question about the purpose of education and how to ensure you have completion of your online course, one of the things we always advise the folks in school districts that we work with is transparency and community engagement. And there's a surprising lack of material available for students at the K-12 level where I work, and I've also noted at the higher ed level, about exactly what technology is being used and what data is being gathered, who is handling it, how it is destroyed, if it is destroyed, and things like that. Basic questions about what do they know about me and who are they sharing it with. And providing your students that sort of information can be very helpful about, one, ensuring that their consent is meaningful, and 2, that you're building trust with your students as data subjects, to put it in privacy parlance, in you as an educator and your institution as a data steward. And so those things are important. Both, one, I think this high level conceptualization of what is the balance between autonomy, the student's autonomy, and the educational goals of the institution. And then second, how do you facilitate engagement with your students and transparency about the data that's being collected on them and how it's being used.
I have often advocated for K-12 curriculum for teachers who are frustrated by some of these questions to be a project oriented to understanding and then presenting on issues related to technology that neither students nor teachers get to choose. So in the early days, that mostly revolved around censorware that was very opaque. It was required by federal law, so all the federal institutions were implementing it. The criteria by which websites were being blocked was very opaque, and the material that we saw being blocked was not what the vendors said they were blocking. Material about reproductive health and issues related to race or queer sexuality and so on had a much higher false positive rate, a false positive rate that was so high that you really had to call it a true positive rate, that the purpose of the system is what the system did. And then, moreover, these firms were the kinds of bullies that we see now in the remote invigilation world, where their critics were often brought to bear under pretextual legal threats. In particular, at EFF, we had a long battle over the DMCA, the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, on behalf of reverse engineers who were taking apart these devices to see what was in their block list, or taking apart these systems. And, as teachers and students were frustrated by these, for many reasons, they would do a lesson plan, and then the resources that they needed for it would be blocked without explanation, and it would take weeks to get it unblocked, and the lesson plan would have to be delivered that day. I often was asked by students, especially, how can we hack this, and should we hack this? And I said, no, because someone will eventually use the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act to try and put you in jail. And instead, why don't you just do ethnography and ask your fellow students and teachers about what's wrong with this software and how it doesn't work? And then if students are circulating information about how to bypass it, which inevitably they are, why don't you document that too as a failure of the tool? And then finally, why don't you do research on the software itself and present it at your school board, at your PTA, and so on, that this is like a project that produces digital literacy, as opposed to using technology as a system of control, where perforce, if you ask the students to understand how it works, you invite them to subvert it and defeat its purpose. And so teachers are given this odd imperative that they're supposed to make their students good at technology, but they're also prohibited from telling the students how the technology works or allowing them to investigate it.
Cory, I was just going to jump in and say,
go ahead.
I also see a common thread with what Barbara was saying, was we need really people from different disciplines, and we need to also recognize that the computer science mindset is a specific tool, right? That's not the only tool we can use. You mentioned ethnography, sociological studies, right? My classes that I've taken in the public policy school in sociology have greatly informed how I've thought about socio-technical systems, right? And so this common thread that we keep noticing is that the purpose isn't we need ethics specifically. The purpose is we need people who can think in different dimensions and understand socio-technical systems from different dimensions.
And I would like to add that
Sure.
I think the marketplace can probably help solve some of the missteps of our universities. I have noticed in my field, cybersecurity, that students vote with their feet. And many of them decided not to go to university because what they wanted to study wasn't being taught in the manner in which they were hoping to be trained. Now, I want to be careful about using the word training. There is a certain amount of training in computer science and in cybersecurity because there's a certain foundation literacy that you need in order to be functional and problem solving. But universities and university professors, as someone mentioned, are more interested in creating graduate students and other academics, and feel it's beneath them in some cases to be producing people for the workplace. And so, as I said, a lot of the people that I work with do not have degrees. Some of them go back and get them, but they aren't going to sit still if they want to pursue something that a university doesn't teach. I think we're going to see, after the pandemic over the next 10 years, a real change in the rankings of universities. I think some that would surprise you will be going away. And I think others are going to be emerging as more and more important. I'm thinking now about Arizona State and how it has climbed up the ladder in terms of adult education and a few other categories and bypassed UW. I mean, it's painful, but I think sometimes success begets bureaucracy and stultified thinking and an unwillingness to step outside the box. And there's no motivation or reward for it either, because you're at the top of the heap. I remember when I was at Boeing, before they had some problems, we had a CEO that said, "Fat cats don't hunt." And here's Boeing, #1 in the world, and very reluctant to try something radically different like this new manufacturing approach they were proposing. Airbus was doing it, but Boeing had no motivation. They already were top of the heap. And so I do think we're going to see inevitable adjustments at universities and different types of learning organizations emerging.
Thank you, Barbara. So we're getting close to the panelist wrap up here, and there's two more questions that I wanted to put to you. And so I thought maybe I could kill two birds with one stone and invite you to reflect on these last two questions in your closing remarks. One comes from Doug Schuler, who's should need no introduction in these circles. Doug is a tireless campaigner on social responsibility in ed tech. And not surprisingly, the question he asks is, what is the role of social responsibility in all of this? And then he poses that as complementary to the ethics question. And then someone whose apparently their birth name is anonymous attendee. That's odd. They tell a charming story really about their days as a student teacher and how their mentor gently pointed out to them that they had locked down all the systems to prevent cheating so thoroughly that not only was no cheating going on, but virtually no learning was going on either. And they ask, you know, one of those easy questions like, what is the proper balance between control, which is not fun, and ease of use, which is fun, which is a question that I'm sure we can all quantify to a couple of decimal places just off the tops of our heads. But it's a good one, I think, to reflect on. And so, I'd like to invite your final remarks now. And if either of those sound like the kinds of questions that you'd like to answer, it would be great to hear your thoughts on them. Again, that's social responsibility and the balance between control and ease of use. And Chris says, what is social responsibility? And that is an excellent question. I mean, I'm going to try to channel Doug here and say that it's, if ethics are what you owe to the users of your technology, social responsibility is what you owe to the world or to your society. And in terms of how it impacts the wider social relations, not just on the microcosm or the microeconomics of that.
Well, I'm glad that Doug has brought up social responsibility, because when I use the term ethics broadly, I was thinking about one's responsibility to society. But you're right, it's a different concept. Ethics, I usually think of someone checking in with their inertial guidance inside themselves, whereas social responsibility is an appreciation and support for the society around you. And I think, again, that goes back to a broad swath of the arts and sciences that we need to include at the table when we design products. We should be thinking about organizational structures, governmental structures, and how we support them with our technology.
Very good. Cody and Chris?
I think that social responsibility, I would not distinguish it from ethics, but perhaps as a important branch of ethics. After all, our friends over in the utilitarian camp are always thinking about what is the good for society, what is the greater good. It's absolutely vital. And I think it falls not only on schools as public schools as democratic institutions, but also on private companies who are producing this sort of technology. And you're starting to see considerations of social responsibility emerge more and more in what have previously been called privacy laws or privacy regimes. And one example of this is in the United Kingdom, where they have just recently articulated the Age Appropriate Design Code, which is less a law and a set of enforceable principles that are designed to protect the well-being of children who use electronic media, which is now today all children. And there are other calls to be for privacy assessments and things like that, all geared toward making companies think about what is the social impact of the product that you are putting out there. And that's especially important for organizations and companies that are making products for use in schools, where there may be lack of consent, where your end users are particularly vulnerable. And so I think social responsibility is, if not the foundation, certainly a key component of it. And I think that's a great question.
I like hearing that the UK is coming up with standards and thinking about the problem. I go back to privacy and where it got its start in Europe and the UK, where they were thinking more aggressively about privacy than we do in the United States. And when you think about what they went through historically with Stalin, with Hitler, certainly privacy was a big lesson that they learned. What did Stalin want to work with? Personnel files, HR files. Well, we make it all that much more readily available these days online, that same information. But this was hair-raising to many of my colleagues in Europe. And I saw that they came out with GDPR, the privacy guidance, and it was so much more draconian, perhaps not originally informed by technology, but there was a reason behind it. And I think it was good to get the conversation on the table. We are developing systems now that have worldwide usage and impact, and companies are thinking internationally. So perhaps some of the wisdom of what you've just described is going to be picked up by, or Cody is going to be picked up by the rest of us and brought to the conversation.
Yeah, the Dutch Digital Rights Group has an annual lecture they call the Godwin Lecture because it involves Nazis, and it commemorates the burning of the Social Services Archive in Amsterdam, which had been, with the best of intention, gathered to with annotations about the ethnic background of every resident of the Netherlands, so that social services could make sure that they had adequate support. And after the Nazis occupied Amsterdam, partisans torched it, and then the firefighters who arrived, who were allied with the partisans, kept their hoses on until all the paper had dissolved. And so this, in honor of this kind of act of deletion, they have an annual lecture. It's rather good. Chris, do you want to give us some final closing thoughts? And then I'm going to turn this over to Jeremy for a pitch for ACM, the institution that's brought us here today.
Yeah, and I want to answer Doug's question with another question, which is, what does democracy look like in the modern era? And I think that's the question that we are all implicitly wrangling with, because it connects with education. And I think that I really grasped to what Cody said with privacy being respecting students' agency, right? Well, we've had to reinvent privacy from the beginning of our democracy. In 1776, it probably would have been, don't quarter soldiers in my house, right? Now it's different, and it looks different because this is a new era with greatly changed technology and impacts on our civil liberties, right? And so to answer a lot of these ethical and social responsibility questions, we need to refine ourselves as a society and really answer and ask deep questions about what civil liberties look like in the modern technological era with social platforms and with greatly enhanced algorithms with deep ramifications. And I know that's not a concrete answer, but I think that we need to start by asking big questions before we can get to solid answers.
Thank you very much. Yeah, and in the spirit of big answers, before I turn it over to Jeremy, since nobody answered poor Anonymous's question about how to balance fun and rigor, or fun and control, you know, as someone who's not a pedagogist but was raised by two EdDs who oversee EdDs for a university and who were lifelong teachers, classroom teachers, and as a beneficiary of alternative schools that were very unstructured, where they really didn't measure anything. I mean, I spent 7 years in a 4-year high school. There were years where I got no credits. There was a year when I moved to Mexico to write and then came back and then re-enrolled. You know, the learning that I did when it arose endogenously out of passion was so much more profound and made me a kind of lifelong autodidact with a lot of interest in a lot of fields and a kind of synthetic approach. And, you know, I understand that, I mean, not even the school I went to does that anymore. Teachers are not able to do that. They are prisoners of metrics and of quantification. And, you know, as they say, you treasure what you measure. But, you know, the great failing of I think the contemporary use of computers in schools, when you go back to old issues of creative computing and kind of hyperventilating essays about the beauty of logo, is that we once thought that we were headed into a world of independent exploration and group-based learning and learning motivated by passion, and that fierce kind of dive into the machine that you get when a computer program takes hold of you. And instead we've just kind of perfected the bubble-in exam form and converted it to HTML, which is really something. And as Barbara said at our very beginning, these are early days. This is not the end of the computer revolution. We have many years to come, and it would be surprising, very, very surprising, if in 10 years, let alone 50 years, the things we did with computers looked anything like the way that we use them now. So Jeremy, I'm going to turn it over to you to tell everyone why they should join the ACM.
Well, thanks very much, Cory. And let me start by thanking you, Cory, and Cody. Figure out the consonants later. Christopher and Barbara. I want to also wish a speedy recovery to Elena. Hopefully she was not injured in her mishap today, but we're thinking of her. I want to point out that Christopher is the lead author on the recently released U.S. Technology Policy Committee position paper on remote testing. And I think it's a really wonderful thing that students can not only follow their faculty, they can lead their faculty, as in the case, in this case. And I encourage anyone who's interested in policy positions, if you thought these were great questions, please consider joining ACM and the U.S. Technology Policy Council of ACM. The instructions, I think Adam is going to put them up on the screen. And speaking of Adam, I really, really, really want to thank Adam. As with any organization like USTPC that is done by volunteers, the real hard work gets done behind the scenes by the small number of staff who make everything happen. And Adam is the staff who makes everything happen. And we really appreciate it, Adam, for organizing us today. Are we about to see the instructions? Yes. If you're interested in joining, here's how to join. No cost to join the USTPC if you're an ACM member. And again, please read our statement on principles for secure remote test administration. And we do tend to run these events roughly once a month on different topics relating to public policy and USTPC. If you have suggested topics that you'd like to see us put together discussions, please let Adam know or me, and we're happy to look at ideas. Again, we welcome your participation in future events. And thank you again, Cory, Cody, Barbara, and Christopher. It's been great to have this discussion tonight. And with that, I'll let everyone go. Have a great afternoon or evening.
Thank you for the opportunity, Jeremy.
Thank you, Barbara.
Yeah, thank you.